Hey, what's up guys? Garden here, coming guys with a new deck profile today. So today we're going to be taking a look at my updated Hexaorb deck for set 3. So yeah, Hexaorb got some pretty cool things in set 3. We have Kakarot here, which is a nice grade 2 support that the deck got. And it kind of changed the deck up overall in terms of its play style. So yeah, without further ado, we'll go into the deck and I'll show you guys what I'm playing. So to start with the ride line, no changes here really. We have the starter, of course, with Triconnect Sorceress. We then have T-Square Sorceress for the grade 1. So when we ride on top of her with Pentagleam, we can counterblast to draw a card, which is pretty good to see pieces. And then we have the Pentagleam Sorceress, which when we ride the Hexaorb Sorceress on top of her, we can check the top 3 cards of the deck and then rearrange them. So pretty good overall. Allows us to get a good stack for the turn 3, which is pretty good. And of course, Hexaorb Sorceress with her main skill is that you can counterblast and soul blast. You may put a trigger, a crit trigger or a front trigger on top of your deck. You reveal up to 1, so you don't have to put a card on top of the deck. But if you want to guarantee that trigger, then you can put one on top. But she'll also get a drive check that turn as well. So she will be triple drive, which is really, really nice. And of course, whenever you drive check a trigger with her main effect at the top, you give one of your rear guards 10k. So you're kind of like doubling up on the trigger power that you're getting when you're drive checking them, which is really, really cool. So that is it for the ride line, so no changes really there. But then we have the main deck, of course, which of course with Hexaorb Sorceress, we have to play the 3 additional copies of Hexaorb, since we do need that Persona Ride to activate her second effect. But yeah, Persona Ride is also just good in general, but we kind of need it in this deck because it's based around Persona Riding. So 3 extra copies of Hexaorb. And then for the next grade 3, we are playing the 3 copies of Fasado. Now, Fasado, I do actually think is quite good right now with set 3, just because there's a little bit of removal in the game right now. So the protection effect that Fasado had can actually come up quite often. Also, the on-hit is always nice as well. Countercharge and the soul charge is always good, especially with Hexaorb, just because we do use both of those resources quite often. But also being a 13k is actually quite nice, since you can actually hit on his own. So you can actually give allocations of 10k power from the Hexaorb to make better magic number columns like 23, 33, and higher. So yeah, I think Fasado is pretty nice right now. So I'm still playing 3 copies of him for the resources and also the numbers that he can make. So next we have grade 2s. We have the best grade 2 in my opinion, which is still going to be Allwyn from set 2. Allwyn is just really, really nice because when you're on a Hexaorb Sorceress, when you place, you can Soul Blast 1 to look at the top 2 cards of your deck, and you can basically put them in any order on the top or the bottom of your deck. So you get the stack 2, which is really, really good. And yeah, you do need to be on Hexaorb, so it is a turn 3 card and onwards. But she does have a really good skill on the second skill, which is when your drive check reveals a trigger unit, you can counterblast 1 to give this unit 10k power. Now this skill actually comes up quite often in this deck, which I'll get to in a bit. But the idea with the deck, of course, is to stack the top of the deck after your Hexaorb turn. The Allwyn will be able to get some stacks, hopefully, and get you some more triggers so that you can activate Hexaorb skill more often, which is really, really nice. But yeah, the 10k power increase actually comes up quite a bit when it comes out to closing out the game. Keep your eyes out on your resources and your counterblast available, and you might find opportunities where that counterblast skill for the power increase can come up a lot of the time to help close the game out. So yeah. So 4 copies of Allwyn. And then we have the new grade 2 that we got from set 3, which is 4 copies of Kakarot. Now this card I absolutely love. Can I just say that I just love this card's artwork? I think it just looks gorgeous, and the triple rare does it justice. But what does Kakarot do? So Kakarot says when placed on Vanguard, if your Vanguard is Hexaorb Sorceress or Pentagleam Sorceress, so this does work on grade 2, which is very important, you can Soul Blast 1 and look at 2 cards from the top of your deck. Put them on top of the deck in any order. So a key difference there is that you are not putting them to the top or the bottom. You are rearranging the top 2. So it's not as good as Allwyn in terms of the stacking capability, but it is really good on the turn 2 turn, since when you're going into your Pentagleam Sorceress, you can actually call this to the rear guard and facilitate more of a rush gameplay in the early game, which is really, really good. And the second skill here is on rear or on Guardian Circle. If your Vanguard is Hexaorb Sorceress, this unit gets 2,000 power and 5,000 shield. So throughout the game, this is basically just going to be a 10k shield as well that you can intercept or guard with. And a 12k attacker is actually not too bad. There's actually a really funny synergy that this card has with the new critical trigger that gives 2,000 power after pushing itself into the soul. So when you have a 12k Kakarot, that 2k power increase to make the Kakarot 14 is actually a lot better, since like I said, 13/14 is just a good magic number to be hitting, especially in terms of 10k power allocations from your Hexaorb. So that's actually pretty cool. And also the trigger itself is a 4k booster, so that also makes your 10k grade 2s hit numbers as well. Now, the other good thing with that stacking skill from the Kakarot is that since your grade 2 Vanguard is only going to do one drive check that turn, rearranging the top two can actually matter quite a lot, since you could see a trigger on the second card, and then you might want to put that to the top so that your drive check can actually get that trigger activated. And this is where I feel like with Kakarot, it actually changes the philosophy of the deck in terms of how you're building it, since I feel like because of the early game rush that this card can enable now on the turn 2 and turn 3 game, we actually want to change up the trigger lineup a little bit, which we'll go more into when we get to the triggers. So yeah, I feel like this is a really nice card for the deck, and it changed it up quite a bit. So I'm playing 4 copies of it for the stacking value, and also the defensive value as well with the shield is pretty nice. So yeah, 4 copies of Kakarot. And then we have the rest of the grade 2s here. We have 3 additional copies of the Hexaorb Sorceress. This is pretty good just because you don't really care too much about it if it dies afterwards, since you're only using it for the on-play skill for a free stacking effect. But it's also just a really nice card to use to facilitate a grade 2 rush, which is kind of what we're going for here. So we also get to stack the deck as well, and this actually combos with the Kakarot in a quite a cool way. So if you look at the top 2 cards of the deck, and maybe you see a trigger, right? So you can put that to the top for your Vanguard the drive check. But maybe the second card is something that you don't particularly want, or you don't want a damage check, or maybe you want to draw it or whatever. It really depends, right? So what you could do is that you could call this to stack the deck, and then depending on what you want and what you don't want, you could actually move the second card to the bottom of the deck with the Hexaorb Sorceress. So you could say put the card that you don't want to the top, then call down the Pentaglane to then put it to the bottom, and then you've got the drive check, which you know is going to be a trigger, hopefully, for your Vanguard, the drive check, and then after that, it's going to be like mysteries after that, right? So, yeah, it's actually quite cool. You got some like synergistic plays here with Kakarot and the Pentaglane Sorceress here, but it's also just another grade 2 that you can call down on the early game to just poke the opponent with, right? Since that's kind of like the strategy we're going for, is more of a grade 2 rush gameplay here, so yeah, 3 additional copies of the Pentaglane for that early game. Alright, and then the last grade 2 of the deck is another new card that we got, which is 2 copies of the Nanofall. So I kind of look at Nanofall in the same way that I do with Pentaglane, right? Is that it's another card that you can call down in the early game, and although I do care a little bit more about Nanofall in comparison to the Pentaglane, Nanofall is just a nice resource tool that we can use as well, if it's necessary. So when your drive check reveals a trigger unit, you can pay the cost of putting a card from your hand into the soul and then draw a card. Now this is really good. So you might notice we have a plethora of grade 2s in the deck, and sometimes we might already have our front row facilitated, especially when we're playing Fasado in the deck as well. Now if we look at our hand and we're like, I've got a bit too many grade 2s in my hand, and they're all a bunch of 5Ks. Well, what we could do is that if we get a trigger, we can put the, something like a Pentaglane into our soul to get an indirect soul charge, which we could use for resource power. But we can also just put that into the soul to then draw a card, and then even then drawing a trigger isn't the worst thing in the world, since that gives us defensive value that we could use on our opponent's turn. Or maybe we stack the deck in such a way that we know that we're going to be drawing into something like a PG, for example, right? So there's a cool application that you can do with the Nanofall here, but I just like it for the fact that it can help filter our hand, but also help us generate more soul in a more direct way. Since of course with Fasado, you need to actually hit in order to get that soul charge, which doesn't always happen. So the Nanofall is a nice early game card that you can also use, but I will only end up calling this down the early game for the rush if I haven't seen other cards like my Pentaglane, which I care a little bit less about. So yeah, this is a nice utility piece, and it's a nice 2-of, I think. So yeah, playing 2 copies of the Nanofall. Alright, so moving on over to the grade 1. So we of course have our staple 4 PGs. Don't really need to explain why we're playing these. Pretty much been playing them since set 1. So yeah, it'd be interesting to do any changes to the perfect cards. But yeah, 4 copies of those as per mandatory. And then we have what I think is the best grade 1 in the deck, in my opinion, which is 4 copies of the Dieglass Sorceress. Now, this card's insane, I think. It came out in set 2, but it's still really, really good. So when this unit is placed on Reguard from your hand, if you have a Vanguard with Hexaorb Sorceress or Pentaglane Sorceress, you can counterblast 1 and discard a card from your hand to look at 2 cards from the top of the deck, choose up the 2 unit cards from among them and call them to Reguard Circle, and then put the rest of the cards on top of the deck. Now this has a lot of implications. So of course the main thing with this is that you can actually use this on the grade 2 turn, which you actually need to think about a little bit, right? So with our ride line, when we're riding into the Pentacleam Sorceress on top of the T-Square Sorceress, we need a Counterblast to draw a card. Now, that is good. So if the opponent has critters in the early game, we have 2 CB to not only draw a card, but also we can use the Diaglass Sorceress as well, which is pretty cool. But of course, on the Pentacleam turn, when we're riding into our grade 2, sometimes maybe we want to use that Counterblast instead of drawing the card to actually call more stuff out with the Diaglass Sorceress to facilitate more of an early game rush, which is not too bad. And remember, Diaglass is an 8k booster as well, so you'll have an 18k common to work with if your opponent's on an 8k base Vanguard, which is really good for magic numbers. So that's one application. Now another application is when you're riding into your Hexaorb Sorceress, of course you will be stacking the top 3 cards of your deck. And I explained this a little bit, I think, during the set 2 profile. But of course, when you're checking the deck, maybe those top 3 cards that you check with Hexaorb when you're riding it, maybe they're not that good. Like maybe you just didn't see any triggers. Well, if you're not seeing triggers, you're probably seeing units that you want to call. So in that regard, you actually want to call the Diaglass down to call those units out so that you can, like, you know, filter them away from the top of the deck so that you can get closer to your triggers. But then also you're just plussing to the field as well, because this is a pretty solid +1 if you call 2 things to the field. If you only call 1 unit, it's not that bad because you're doing a 1-for-1 exchange at that point. But you do have to pay a Counterblast, which is kind of it's not really that great, but it does help you facilitate a field setup that you can push with, right? So that's pretty good there as well. But obviously just the stacking capabilities as well alongside this is also good, since it, you know, pairs up with all your other stacking effects, just help Hexaorb see triggers. So yeah, there are a ton of applications with Diaglass, and I still think it's the best grade 1 that we have right now, just in terms of facilitating early game rush, but also just pushing capability as well. So you want to push the opponent as much in the early game so that when we get to the late game, we can then start pressuring them with the trigger pressure and the power pressure that Hexaorb is going to be giving to our rear guards, basically. So yeah. So that's sort of the idea there. So 4 copies of Diaglass, really good card. Still great from set 2. Now, we did get a new grade 1, which is actually good as well, but it's also a little bit awkward, which I'll explain. So we got 3 copies of the new Persona Ride Searcher, which is Tortoise. So Tortoise basically says when placed on Rearguard, if you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard, you can Counterblast 1, search your deck for the 1 Hexaorb Sorceress and add it to your hand, but then shuffle your deck. Now, that is important to remember, since if we're going to be on Hexaorb, the turn that we ride into it, we're going to be stacking the deck as well. Now, if we stack the deck and we see triggers, we kind of want those, right? But then this is where the deck gets a little bit awkward, because if we see triggers, we want them, but we also want guaranteed Persona rides on the next turn. So this is really debate on like what you have in your hand, really, since you kind of want a Hexaorb Sorceress in your hand ready for your turn 4 so that you can set up that Persona ride, which I think is more important than, you know, getting guaranteed triggers stacked on the grade 3 turn. So when you see your hand and your setup, if you have a Hexaorb setup for the Persona ride, that's great, which means you don't need to use this, which means you don't need to ruin the stack that you're doing with Hexaorb. But if you don't see a Hexaorb Sorceress and you don't have one for the turn 4, maybe at that point you might need to consider just ignoring the stack that you're doing with Hexaorb and just guarantee the Persona ride that you can search out with the Tortoise. So yeah, it's a little bit awkward there. The shuffle the deck part is kind of like putting a spanner in the works here in terms of the way Hexaorb is working on turn 3, but it will really depend on the pieces that you have and what you have set up for the turn 4. So just be careful of that. So I thought I'd just mention that just in case, since I feel like it's something that's a little bit overlooked. You know, people just see the fact that this card's a Persona Ride Searcher and it's like, oh, that's good, right? Well, it is good, but it's also situational to when you're going to be using it. So I still wanted to play 3 of it in the deck, though, since we do want to consistently get to Hexaorb for those Persona rides. And yeah, we only have 3 Hexaorb in the main deck anyway, so I felt like playing more than 3 of this was kind of irrelevant. And like I said, with the complication this card adds anyway to the deck in terms of searching, but also shuffling, it's a little bit awkward. So yeah, I felt like 3 copies of it was good enough. So I went with the 3 copies. Alright, so with that out of the way, we now have the triggers, which we also need to explain a little bit here. So there's actually a lot to explain with this deck. It actually got changed quite a bit with set 3. So of course, something we don't need to explain is the over trigger. I mean, of course we're going to play that, so don't really need to talk about that. Alright, but then we have the trigger lineup. So I decided to go with 4 copies of the new crit, which is of course going to be seen. But then we also have 2 copies of the set 1 crit with Disma. Now I decided to go for 6 crit. Now, like I said before, with the dragon, it can actually come up with the Kakarot in terms of that power increase, which is really cool. But also, you're going to be using the fact that this can go into the soul a lot more often, since you can boost a 10k grade 2 to make it 14, and then apply that 2k power to say your Kakarot to then make that 14. So you're hitting better numbers overall, which is pretty cool. Also, you could give that 2k power to your Vanguard as well, bear in mind, since your Vanguard could go to 15 and then an 8k booster could then make it 23. So that's also another application. So yeah, I decided to go for 6 crit, and this will make more sense when I show you the fact that I play 5 fronts in the deck. So I'm playing 1 copy of the vanilla front trigger from set 1, but then we also have 4 copies of the 20k shield front trigger. Now, the reason I decided to go for this was because I felt like with the fact that we have more board presence in the early game from like grade 2 onwards, front triggers I feel like are a lot more facilitated in this deck, since, you know, combining crits and fronts together can be very deadly. Since we don't have like the multi-attack aspect of like other decks like Bastion, we kind of just have to rely on like the 3 columns that we have to work with. So the best way to do that is to rush them in the early game, get them to about 4 damage, and then when you get them to that threshold, the crits pretty much become lethal at that point, right? Since the crit will just kill them. So not only do they have to worry about a crit just ending them, but then also the fronts can help facilitate the power increase that we need if they're at like 5 damage, for example. So 5 damage means that we can just focus on the front trigger aspect of the deck and then just push them with really large columns. And that's where the skills like All-Win are going to come up, where the extra counterblast for the 10k will actually help you close out the game in those scenarios, which I think is really, really cool. Now, another aspect is the fact that I thought, well, if I'm only going to play the 4 front, if I see this in my hand, and because like power thresholds can be quite deadly sometimes I might be using these to just survive. And I thought, well, it's kind of awkward, especially if I want to keep these in my hand to set up on top of the deck with Hexaorb to get a front trigger guaranteed on my next turn. Well, that's why I wanted the 5th front in the deck, because I thought, well, if I'm defending with these and I don't have like any other copies of these in my hand, if I have the vanilla one, I could just guard with these ones with the 20k shield, and then I could use this for my push turn next turn with Hexaorb to get that front trigger effect. So yeah, so I actually quite like this idea. I feel like the fronts are a lot more facilitated in this version of the deck with the early game pressure that we have, and because we have more board presence in general, I feel like the fronts just have more potency overall. But if you don't like this, you could just take out this front trigger and then put in another crit. That's also okay. Like 7 crit is also okay in the deck as well. But I do like the idea of playing the extra front trigger in this deck. I do think it's quite nice change in comparison to other lists that I've seen. But yeah, to wrap the deck up, we of course have the 4 heal trigger as well. And yeah, don't really need to explain that. Playing the Sorceress heal trigger to go with the Hexaorb theme. And that's going to do it for the deck. So yeah. So this has been Hexaorb Sorceress with set 3. Of course, Kakarot and many other units we got. We got the Torturous, we got the grade 2 Kakarot as well. Just get those out here to showcase. But yeah, that's pretty much going to do it for the deck. I quite like the deck overall. The changes that it's seen is definitely quite nice. It's a little bit different than like the Lepisto version that we've been doing from like set 1 to set 2. But I do feel like this strategy does kind of work with the grade 2 rush and then facilitating that with the big punches that you can do in the late game to help close the game out, basically. But yeah, that's going to do it for the deck. So I hope I explained it well enough for you guys. If you have any suggestions or comments you would like to make, of course, put those in the comment section below. But that's going to do it for me. So like always, guys, this is Guardian25. I will see you in the next video, which I'm not too sure what it's going to be at the minute. I think in terms of decks with Overdress, I'm probably going to do Dragonic Overlord next, since I've actually been playing that deck quite a bit recently, and I actually quite like the new tools that it got. But yeah, anyway, this is going to be Guardian25 signing out.